islands are. It's a real thing, where clocks don't matter as much and moments stretch out.
It's wild, it's windswept, it's unique.
The Chatham Islands give you space to reset, to fill your spirit, and to unplug from the noise.
It's also home to about a third of New Zealand's threatened species, unique plant life, and a rich cultural history that's undergoing a revival. But the Chatham Islands has problems. It's expensive, relies on diesel, its infrastructure is failing, there are no jobs to keep young people on the island, and a key government presence there, the Department of Conservation, is once again being restructured. I'm Alexia Russell, and today on The Detail, it's been a year since Regional Development Minister Shane Jones landed with a Hercules full of business leaders, media and officials promising to help fix things.
Vekohu, Whanipoli, Chatham Islands, greetings.
My newsroom colleague Jonathan Milne was on that flight, so we're checking in with him again. And later I'll also be talking to Newsroom's environment editor David Williams about what's up with DOC. Since last year, there's a new mayor and a new council chief executive after the last one went overboard with his ratepayer-funded home renovations. Jonathan has been following the saga.
For a couple of years now, the Auditor General's Office has been sounding a note of concern about the financial statements from the council every year and questioning whether it could actually remain as a going concern, which is a pretty serious concern. And the council had acknowledged that and said, well, basically we are really struggling. They were constantly living at the very limit of their $500,000 overdraft. The former mayor, Monique Croon, told me that there were rusty, derelict cars piling up all over the island that they couldn't afford to move. They couldn't afford to fix the potholes on the road, despite some funding from NZ Transport Authority. So they were really struggling just to do the basics. Their rates can't even come close. They don't even pay a fraction of what it costs to maintain the infrastructure on the island, like the roads, like the airport, like the port. So what they get is a grant from Internal Affairs from the government every year, several $1 million, that basically keeps the wheels turning. But they say even that wasn't enough, and they were struggling to deliver.
So a situation like that probably makes it worse that your chief executive's spending money that hasn't been approved.
Yeah, I mean, I talked to you about this $500,000 overdraft and they're living at the limits of that. Well, guess what? The new CEO comes onto the island and even before he started in the role, he tells the outgoing CEO, hey, you need to put some real money into the council house that I'm going to be bringing my wife and child over to live in because it's pretty run down, hasn't been upgraded for about 15, 16 years. So initially the council agreed to, do about $200,000, I think, on renovation. And then with the incoming CEO, Paul Eagle's urging, they upped that to $500,000, $500,000, the same number as their bank overdraft. So this ended up being quite gold-plated. Paul Eagle asked for, high-end merely kitchen appliances. So it became quite shambolic. He ended up taking over as chief executive, running the project himself. And it wasn't just this. There were all kinds of big contracts being let to do strategic work, one of which they approved his wife subcontracting on this. So it was all starting to turn into a really bad look. And one of the locals, we think, wrote to the Auditor General and said, hey, and the Auditor General said, we can have a look into this. So bear in mind that Auditor General was already concerned about the finances of the council and whether it could remain a going concern. And now they've got this added concern of a chief executive who seems to be spending with some kind of reckless disregard and getting his expenses signed off sometimes by the mayor, sometimes by the council, sometimes probably not really at all.
This is Andrew Goddard, a senior inquiry specialist at the Office of the Auditor General, after that report was released.
In a nutshell, our inquiry found that the council didn't have adequate systems to manage procurement and sensitive expenditure appropriately. It had relevant policies, but it didn't routinely follow them, and that its processes to monitor and control spending were not working well. We also saw examples where the chief executive had provided misleading information to our office, and we have drawn this to the attention of the council, Parliament and the public.
He got 6 months rent-free because the house wasn't ready to his standards when the family got there. So they put him up in an accommodation on the island rent-free. And yet, nonetheless, he still also felt the need to charge, I think I added up about $14,000 of expenses pretty much on food. And then thousands more on the credit card also, presumably on food and stuff. The money was just twittering through his fingers.
Wow.
And this on an island that was really worried about its own financial sustainability. So you can imagine that locals were getting pretty concerned about this.
And he's been caught out. He's gone.
He has quit after the draft Auditor General's report came out, and I've seen the final version of the report, and it was damning. He quit under some degree of duress, one suspects, from the new mayor, Greg Horler, and the Serious Fraud Office is considering whether it too will investigate formally. It's difficult to understand quite how he thought this was responsible behaviour. I would say that, there's no allegation of fraud or that he was lining his own pockets, but it certainly looked pretty reckless. And this from a community that was really straight in for cash.
Yeah, it must be heartbreaking for the community.
Yeah, and I guess the wider context is that this community is already, and was when I visited there last year, in talks with government over what structures and what funding were needed for it to continue. This is an existential question, whether the Chatham Islands, 800 kilometres offshore from New Zealand, can actually remain as a community with people living and working and going to school there. The requirements of a remote community now are far more than they were 100 or 200 years ago. We could look back nostalgically and say, 100 years ago, they probably lived pretty much a self-sustaining life of agriculture and fishing. But these days, there are basics that you need. You need to be able to export your goods to the world. You need electricity, you need data, internet. All this stuff is expensive to provide. They've built, with a big grant from central government, a large, significant wind farm on a peak at the top of the island that's designed to bring down their power bills, because they're paying phenomenal amounts for just basic electricity. Just to run a fridge or a freezer and keep the lights on in your home is enormously expensive in the Chathams. So this is the kind of infrastructure that is basic now. You need it in the 21st century, but it doesn't come cheap.
It is so fantastic to be here in the Chatham Islands. I'm down at the port. Significant announcement around procuring finally the new vessel here for shipping services to the Chatham Islands. There's an agreement now signed off by Cabinet to start negotiations with McCullum Brothers and Nova Marine on a new 78-metre vessel. Now that's going to be vital for the resiliency of the island. Everything that comes in and off this island, barring a bit of air freight, is done by these vessels, and we're talking livestock, we're talking groceries, products, resources, gear for the Fulton Hogan crew doing the roading out here.
That's Associate Transport Minister James Meagher last September, announcing a $24 million replacement for the 40-year-old Southern Te Ari. That lifeline of a ship keeps breaking down and is unreliable to the extent that a couple of years ago, cattle couldn't get to the abattoir on the mainland to be slaughtered, and nearly 6,000 had to be culled. The new boat should be in operation by the end of next year. The council also gets $4.2 million a year from Internal Affairs in recognition that its ratepayer base can't possibly cover all the expenses. In fact, Jonathan says the island is just about entirely bankrolled by the New Zealand taxpayer.
The government's invested in the wharf, the government's invested in the airport, the government's invested in the wind farm. I talked to Shane Jones, the Minister for Regional Development, about this a few months ago. He says, actually, I'm getting together all the chiefs of all the public sector agencies that deal with the Chatham Islands just to add up how much the taxpayer is investing in the Chatham Islands, because we don't even know the total number yet. It's so much. NZTA is probably one of the biggest funding agency because it puts money into the roads there, which is still in pretty terrible shape, I have to say. I'm sorry, NZTA.
But can you look at a community like the Chathams and say, you're just not economically viable, everybody pack your bags?
I asked the Minister that question, on the ground in Chatham Islands, at Waitangi in the Chatham Islands a year ago this month. I said, how much can the taxpayer invest to maintain this community when clearly the young people of this community are voting with their feet. They're leaving, and they're not coming back because there are no jobs, there are no houses to come back to. They've got their own housing crisis there on the Chathams. I asked the minister, and he was very adamant then, we will not turn our back on a community like this. We will continue to support them. I asked him the same question again earlier this year, and he was a whole lot more equivocal. And I think he's looking at them, and possibly, he's heavying them a little bit to, as he sees it, get their house in order. And he's kind of leaving open the question as to how long and how much the government can continue to support them. And that's why we're now at a position where he's been having some very robust conversations with leadership of the islands, with the new mayor who was more or less elected on an anti-Shane Jones platform, and anti having to do compromise deals with the government, at least, platform. Shane Jones wanted two key bodies on the island to merge, to amalgamate. One of them is an independent endowed trust, the Chatham Islands Enterprise Trust. It's actually relatively well off. It owns forestry and it owns a lot of seafood quota, a lot of fishing quota. That's a trust, and the beneficiaries are the people of the island, and it reinvests in assets and infrastructure on the island, like that wind farm that I talked about earlier. It's doing okay. The council is the other big governance organisation that's pretty much bust, pretty much bankrupt. And so what Shane Jones is saying, why don't we merge these two, and the earning capacity, the revenue making capacity of the trust can be fed into the jobs that the Chatham Islands Council can't afford to do, keeping the roads maintained, fixing the potholes, getting rid of the rubbish. He's been pushing for that for the last year or so. The new mayor had pushed back pretty hard against that, despite the former CEO, Paul Eagle, acting as a very friendly go-between, bearing in mind that Paul Eagle was mates with Shane Jones. The new mayor had been pretty anti doing any kind of merger deal as the minister had wanted, but Shane Jones dragged him through the public mill, really, attacking him quite strongly in the media and interviews.
What was the mayor's reasoning? What are the cons of it?
So as far as the mayor was concerned, a lot of people on the island were concerned, this is an independent endowed trust. It's nothing to do with the government. For the government to force it to be merged with the council and to pay the bills for public infrastructure like roads, they saw as wrong. I think they saw it as essentially taking their birthright as islanders, their fisheries, their forestry, and the government using it for its own purposes, even if those purposes would have benefited the communities on the island. They felt that the Crown, the government, should be chipping in itself a little bit more. The difficulty is that obviously this endowed trust is not, you can't just go and raid private trusts even if there is a clear public good. So there's been quite a tense standoff. The trust and the council, the new mayor, have been working side by side and going back and forth with ministers, with Shane Jones and with Mark Patterson, trying to find a solution. I understand that they have quite recently delivered a new proposal to the ministers. So initially they'd sort of agreed to some solutions around their assets, around their airport and other assets. But the ministers came back and said, nah, not good enough. We want a merger. We want
kind of thing.
Yeah, we want the council and the trust fully merged so that all of those assets that the trust has are available to support and maintain public assets, public infrastructure on the islands. The council, I understand, has now gone back to ministers with a proposal that will give the government a lot of what it wants. So basically it would create a new governance entity from the trust and the council that would be responsible for all the public infrastructure on the island, pretty much. The port, the airport, the wind farm, the roads, the water, maybe not power, but most of the others, yeah. What they want to carve out is the key revenue earning assets, the fisheries and the forestry, which they say should still be managed separately. This new entity, this new governance entity, I understand, they are proposing would have a ministerial representative on the board, but it wouldn't have, as previously proposed, a taxpayer shareholding. So the government wouldn't own a stake in it, but would have a say in how it's run. So we're yet to hear back. We're yet to find out what Shane Jones and Mark Patterson think of this idea. I don't think this one's over yet. I think that the Minister Jones in particular is going to want basically some means for the government to have a share in it, to have a stakeholding in this.
Let's turn now to the wildlife. Newsroom's David Williams has been looking at another controversy.
Well, setting the scene, Chatham Islands, 800 kilometres east of the South Island, and it's got an array of amazing plants and animals and fish and birds. It's a pretty special place. If you remember, that was where the black robin recovered. So that was one of our most amazing conservation stories in the history of New Zealand. So it has, I've seen different figures, between a quarter and a third of New Zealand's endangered species. So conservation-wise, it's a very important and special place.
And as such, I guess we'd have lots of DOC people looking after it.
There you go. So yes, you would presume, and DOC would say they do. They do have an adequate amount of staffing to do the work that needs to be done. But going back a couple of years, they had this big restructuring proposal. At the time, they had 10.5 full-time equivalent positions, and then there was this restructure, and that was cut down to just under 5 positions in terms of full-time equivalents. And there was, there were issues. The documents I've seen talked about it being dysfunctional. The leadership was poor. People didn't have a great connection to the mainland. I guess it's neither here nor there whether that's important. DOC thinks it's important, so it is. And so they went through this restructure, and I guess the news this week is that we've finally, after 609 days of an ombudsman's complaint, been released documents that highlighted some of the risks that people thought might happen back in May 2024 about this restructure and what it might mean for conservation. People were really worried. They didn't think that there was enough expertise or enough staff on the ground to do the work. And so the follow-up is people are saying that is very much the case, unfortunately. I think the more important thing on the Chathams, and certainly the people on the island who I speak to say, is they want a deep connection to DOC, and they feel like DOC is less visible. They are doing what appears to be less work, and there are real problems. A bloke I spoke to called Brent Mallinson, he runs Flowerpot Bay Lodge on Pitt Island. He says there are years and years and years of fencing to be done, and it's not being done, and people are coming over from them.
Fencing?
Certainly some of it, yeah. Important reserves that protect our native species, not being done, and there are problems. There are certain species that are being munched by cats, and that's not good enough. DOC acknowledges that fencing has been an ongoing issue, and it's something that's a real priority for them. But, people are being sent from the mainland, and they might not know exactly where they're going, or they might not know exactly what type of species are important. And so there is, in terms of there was a disconnection before, well, it seems like there's a different kind of disconnection happening now. To give DOC their dues, they said, okay, well, we're going to reduce the number of people on island, but we're going to bring in people in summer. We're going to bolster that summer workload because that's where the majority of our work is. And so we'll fly people in for short periods or, sustained periods over summer, and we'll get the work done that way. And their contention was this isn't a cost-saving measure, this is actually being more efficient. We don't need people on the island all the time, it's a long way to go and it's an expensive place to live. We'll just fly people in temporarily and that'll get the job done. So that's what they would say.
So what's the status of DOC's contribution to the Chathams at the moment?
Well, I don't think people are very happy. The Chatham Islands Mayor Greg Hawler told me in February that he was concerned about the level of conservation work being done, and it appears that DOC is listening a bit, so they have decided this year to change their structure again, and what they're doing is they're making 3 of their staff project leads, so they're giving them leadership roles. Now, some would argue that if their structure was so good and working well, they wouldn't have to make changes. So there's that. But you listen to Brent Mallinson, he's talking about the fencing, he's talking about particular species. He doesn't think that DOC and what it does, the conservation work that it's charged with doing by the people of New Zealand and under legislation, he doesn't think that it's doing the job it needs to. So it'll be interesting to see what changes, if any, DOC makes in response to that criticism.
I mean, I guess you could say it's expensive. There's only 650 people living on the island. There are a few tourists because there's not much accommodation. Does this put it down the priority list for conservation? Because there's no one to see the work being done successfully?
Well, that's the danger, isn't it? It's so far away, and if there aren't eyeballs on that, but that's why you have a conservation board. A conservation board gets briefed by DOC on the work program that it has, and it asks questions and it holds it accountable. That's its job. So there are eyeballs in that sense. But yes, it is far away, and in terms of DOC and its huge priorities, you would think that its priorities are on the mainland. And for a place like DOC, because it has had to cut its budget, it's struggling with maintaining a huge network of tracks and structures and huts, and so it is having to pick and choose what it's doing. And if you're a cynical person, you would say it chooses fluffy, feathery type things that resonate well with the public, things like kia, things like kiwi. And the plant species that might not be a front of mind, and many people who would never see those plant species maybe don't get the love and attention that they deserve. But if you start with that as a premise, you kind of wonder, well, you're just in a downward spiral and eventually all species will end. So you've got to hold your line, and it's a matter of Conservation Department deciding where that line is and then the public deciding whether that's acceptable or not.
What do they want? You have spoken to Chatham Islanders. What would they like to see in regards to DOC staffing?
Well, I think the impression I get is that they feel that DOC doesn't have the presence it should, and part of that is having boots on the ground. If people have a problem, they want to be able to know who to go to sort that out. And in a place like the Chathams, there are all sorts of things that happen, and they don't necessarily come to mind. Yes, you've got conservation work. You need to do the predator fencing. You need to kill the predators and that kind of thing. But there's also things like whale strandings, and so people need to have the equipment and the knowledge to be able to deal with those things, because they do happen periodically, and it falls to DOC to do that. And there are question marks over whether I've seen some conservation board minutes, and they suggest that there is a change to the whale stranding program on the Chathams because things weren't done properly. So yes, those are some of the things that do fall through the cracks.
So plants may die out, birds may become more endangered, but the people are staying.
Some of them have been there, their families have been there generations and generations and generations. It's home, they love it, they believe that they can make the community there sustainable, and I want to believe them. I absolutely 100% want to believe them, because it's a beautiful and special place, and so much love and sweat and blood has been put into sustaining that community that they deserve to be able to keep it running. But I also understand that the government can look at it and say, well, there's only so much money that the government should keep on putting into it.
Yeah, what is the value of having the Chathams the way it is to the rest of the country?
Well, there's one very commercial value to the Chathams, and this sounds a bit cynical, but its location 800 kilometres offshore creates an almost entire additional chunk of exclusive economic zone for New Zealand where we can control the fisheries. So that's, as the islanders see it, that's their gift to New Zealand, a whole lot of extra fisheries revenue.
Yeah.
And they would argue that they should be entitled to a bigger chunk of that fisheries revenue, which they kind of lost back in the 80s when the new quota system was brought in. Because, if the Chatham Islands weren't part of New Zealand's EEZ and its fisheries zone would be significantly smaller.
That's it for today. The Details of Newsroom production, supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was engineered by Chris Wethy and produced by Gwen McClure. Thanks to Jonathan Mill and David Williams. I'm Alexia Russell. Ka kite.